The wind came tearing across the open prairie that afternoon, sharp as broken glass and colder than the steel barrel of a winter rifle. Clara Whitlock tugged her shawl tighter as she stepped out of her cabin, her boots sinking into snow crusted hard by the night frost. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that made every sound snap, every hoofbeat, every breath, every heartbeat. Life along the frontier had taught her to listen more carefully than most, and today something felt off. Too quiet, too still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She had gone out to tend to her mare blossom, who whickered softly from inside the barn. Clara pushed the door open, expecting to smell hay and hear the comforting rustle of animals. Instead, the first thing she noticed was a streak of dark red across the snow just outside the threshold, so stark it stole the air from her lungs. Blood. Fresh. Clara froze. Her mind leapt straight to danger wolves, a cougar, a wounded deer that had dragged itself through. But the prints beside the crimson streak weren't hooves or paws. They were human, large, barely dragging through the snow as though the person could hardly hold themselves up. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear clawing at her ribs. She lived alone, miles from the nearest settlement. Anyone bleeding and desperate enough to crawl into her barn could be trouble she couldn't afford. But something deeper tugged at her, a pull she didn't understand yet. Slowly, silently, Clara eased into the barn, her hand gripping the handle of the pitchfork resting beside the door. Sunlight filtered through the slats in thin, golden stripes, cutting across the shadows. For a moment, she saw nothing. Only Blossom pawing nervously, ears pinned. Then she heard it. A low, ragged groan, soft, pained, and defiantly human. Clara's breath hitched. The sound came from the far stall, half hidden behind the feed barrels. With each step she took, the groaning grew clearer, each inhale sounding like a man fighting to stay alive. She rounded the corner and gasped. A Comanche warrior lay crumpled on the straw. Blood soaked the leather of his leggings and darkened the fringed sash across his chest. An arrow shaft had snapped beside him. The wound at his side was swollen and angry. His dark hair, braided and tied with beads, was matted with sweat. One hand clutched the ground as though trying to claw his way to escape, but he no longer had the strength. His eyes opened at the sound of her gasp, sharp, wild and dark as midnight rivers. Even half conscious, he looked like a man carved from stubborn stone, refusing to die quietly. Clara's instincts screamed danger. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Don't trust a Comanche. Not to trust any man carrying a weapon, even if it is his own blood spilling on the floor. But the man couldn't even lift his head. He wasn't a threat. He was dying. Clara swallowed hard. Her hands trembled on the pitchfork, but she didn't lower it. Not yet. Instead, she asked the question that would change her life forever. Who did this to you? The warrior blinked, his breath shallow. His lips parted, and the single word he rasped out chilled her more than the winter wind outside. Posse. Clara's world snapped into sharp focus. Someone had chased him. Someone armed. Someone close. And if they had tracked him this far, they would come to her doorstep next. She should have run. She should have shut the barn door and pretended she saw nothing. But instead she whispered, I'll help you. And with those three quiet words, her life and her heart veered irrevocably onto a new, dangerous path. Clara didn't remember making the decision. One moment she was staring at the wounded Comanche warrior lying in her barn, torn between instinct and fear. The next, she was shoving aside the pitchfork, dropping to her knees, and slipping her arm beneath his shoulders to help him sit upright. His skin burned beneath her touch, feverish, trembling. He was far heavier than he looked, and Clara struggled to lift him, her breath coming in small, startled bursts. Easy, easy, she murmured, though she knew he likely didn't understand her words. But the tone carried, and he let her guide him, even as he winced, jaw clenched tight against the pain tearing through his side. The barn felt suddenly too open, too exposed. If the posse had wounded him and followed his tracks, they'd soon find hers crossing his. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. She cast a wide-eyed glance at the barn door, imagining shadows cresting the horizon, men with rifles raised, demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. "We can't stay here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She braced her feet in the straw, using every ounce of strength she had to half drag him toward the trapdoor that led to the root cellar beneath her cabin. He stumbled, his hand gripping her sleeve so tightly she felt his desperation in his fingers. She didn't push him away. Once inside, the small cabin felt suffocatingly warm compared to the bitter wind outside. Clara cleared the table with a sweep of her armbooks, jars, and sewing tools clattering to the floor and lowered him as gently as she could onto the surface. His breath came in harsh, uneven gasps. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to study her face, confusion and something like reluctant trust flickering there. "I'll fetch water," she said quickly, more a vow than a plan. Her hands shook as she filled a basin from the pot near the hearth. Every movement felt clumsy. The weight of what she was doing pressed on her. A lone homesteader woman hiding a wounded Comanche warrior wanted by a posse. If anyone found out, the consequences would be brutal. They wouldn't listen to explanations. They wouldn't let her speak. She forced the thoughts away and hurried back to him. The wound was ugly, an arrow that had been torn out roughly, leaving splintered fragments buried inside. His skin around it was swollen, hot, and reddened with infection. Clara's stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had tended to her father's injuries after wagon accidents. She had stitched her own hand once after a bad fall. But this was different. This was a man who, by all the laws and prejudices of the land, she should have feared. Instead, she feared losing him. "Hold still," she whispered. He stared at her as if trying to understand why she was helping him at all. Clara dipped a cloth in the warm water and pressed it gently to the wound. He hissed, muscles tensing, but he didn't pull away. She cleaned the blood, then searched her cupboard for the small jar of salve she had made from pine resin and crushed herbs. Her mother had taught her its healing properties before fever took her. "Please let this work," she murmured, applying the mixture. "Please." As she worked, the Comanche's eyes drifted closed, not in unconsciousness, but in the fragile surrender of a man who finally feels the sting of safety after too much running. Then, just as Clara was wrapping a clean strip of linen around his torso, hooves thundered in the distance. Her breath caught. Not one horse. Several. The posse had arrived. Clara froze, staring at the door, heart slamming against her ribs. She had lied to herself thinking she had time. She had none. With the Comanche barely clinging to life, Clara made her choice with the speed of lightning. She grabbed his arm, tugged him toward the trapdoor beneath the rug, and whispered fiercely, "Hide, don't make a sound. I'll deal with them." Clara heaved the rug aside, fingers fumbling with the iron ring embedded in the floorboards. The trapdoor creaked open with a groan that sounded far too loud in the small cabin. The warrior, weak, barely conscious, tried to help himself descend, but his legs buckled beneath him. Clara caught him under the arms, her breath trembling as she struggled to lower him into the root cellar without dropping him. "Just a little further," she whispered, urging him down the ladder rung by rung. His weight sagged heavily against her, but he didn't cry out, not even when the movement tore at his wound. His teeth were clenched tight, his skin clammy with fever. Clara's heart twisted, torn between fear for him and fear of the men outside. Once he was inside, she hurriedly lowered a blanket, a jug of water, and a small lantern. The thunder of hooves drew closer, loud, aggressive, and unmistakably angry. Clara cast one last desperate glance at the warrior. Their eyes met briefly, his dark, steady despite the pain, hers wide with panic. He lifted a trembling hand, touching his chest, then pointed upward. "I trust," he rasped. The words were broken, accented, but clear enough to steal her breath. Before she could answer, he slumped back into the shadows, and she dropped the trapdoor shut. She dragged the rug into place just as fists slammed against her door. Bang, bang, bang. "Clara Whitlock, open up!" Her blood turned cold. She recognized the voice, Sheriff Ames, a man who prided himself on being the law in a land too wild to listen to it. He was not patient. He was not merciful. Clara smoothed her hair, wiped her trembling hands on her skirt, and stepped toward the door. She forced her face into the calmest expression she could muster, then opened it. Sheriff Ames and 5 riders crowded her porch, snow swirling around them like restless ghosts. Their horses stomped impatiently, breath steaming in the bitter air. The sheriff's coat flapped open, revealing a rifle slung across his chest. "Evenin', Miss Whitlock," he said, tipping his hat in a gesture far more polite than his eyes. His gaze hardened as it swept past her into the cabin, scanning for movement. "We're tracking a Comanche renegade. Dangerous one. Wounded. Might have come this way." Clara's pulse hammered, but she forced herself to hold steady. "I haven't seen anyone," she replied. "Just tending to chores." Earlier, she might have sounded uncertain. But now she felt the weight of the warrior's trust. She steadied her spine. Ames sniffed, then stepped inside without being invited. His boots left melting snow on her floorboards as he peered around, poking into corners he had no business inspecting. "Funny thing," he said, nudging aside a fallen jar with the toe of his boot, "his tracks led right behind your barn." Then vanished. Clara angled herself between him and the rug. "Tracks get blown away quickly with this wind," she said. One of the men outside called in, "Sheriff," blood on the snow near the barn. Clara felt the floor vanish beneath her feet. Ames's attention snapped back to her, suspicion darkening his face. Care to explain that? Her heart galloped. Her hands felt weightless. "Think, Clara, think. I butchered a chicken this morning," she lied. "Must have dripped." Ames's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, so close she could smell tobacco on his breath. "You sure that's all it was?" Clara's throat tightened. The cabin seemed to shrink around her, fear squeezing her chest like a vice. "Yes," she whispered. A long, unbearable silence stretched between them. Then Ames's expression shifted. Not acceptance calculation. "We're searching the property," he announced, "top to bottom. You've got nothing to hide. You won't mind." Clara's breath faltered. Her vision blurred at the edges. They were going to find him, unless she stopped them. She stepped forward, blocking the doorway with more courage than she felt. "You'll mind your manners in my home, Sheriff," she said, voice shaking but clear. "And you'll respect the law you claim to uphold." Ames froze, surprised. Clara held her ground. "If you want to search anything on my land," she said, "you'd better have cause, not guesses." The sheriff stared at her for a long, dangerous moment. Outside, the hooves stomped restlessly. Inside, under her feet, a wounded warrior fought to breathe in silence. Finally, Ames spit on the floor. "You're a fool, Clara," he growled. "But we'll be back." He signaled his men, turned his horse, and thundered away. Clara watched them disappear into the white horizon, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. Only when the last hoofbeat faded did she allow her knees to give out. She sank to the floor, breath trembling, whispering, "It's over." For now. But deep inside she knew the storm had only begun. When the posse finally disappeared beyond the ridge, Clara remained kneeling on the floor, palms pressed flat against the wooden boards that hid the man she had nearly died lying for. Her heartbeat was a frantic flutter beneath her ribs, her breath shallow, her mind spinning like a storm-tossed wheel. She had stood up to the Sheriff Ames, a man known for pushing people until they cracked, and she hadn't cracked. But she wasn't sure she had won either. Ames would return. And next time, he wouldn't come with questions. He'd come with suspicion sharpened into certainty. Clara shook herself back to motion. She pushed up from the floor and rushed to the trapdoor, lifting the rug with trembling hands. When she opened it, the lantern glow revealed the warrior slumped against a crate, one hand pressed to his wound as though holding in the pain by sheer will. "Tayan," she whispered, testing his name for the first time. She had heard it murmured in his fever when she'd been tending him earlier. "It's safe to come up for the moment." He stirred. His eyes opened, dark and heavy with pain, but still fiercely alert. Slowly, he climbed the ladder, one rung at a time. Clara helped him once he reached the top, sliding an arm around his back and guiding him to the bed beside the hearth. He collapsed onto it with a low, muted groan. "You lied for me," he said quietly. The words were rough-edged, accented, but clear enough to strike right into her chest. She bit her lip, unable to look at him for a moment. The truth of what she'd done was hitting her now that the danger had passed, at least temporarily. "I couldn't let them kill you," she said. "And they would have. Whether you'd done anything wrong or not." His gaze lifted, steady and unblinking. "You risked much, I know." Her voice came out small. Clara turned away, busying herself with the kettle and the bandages even though her hand still shook. She felt his eyes on her, studying her, questioning her, trying to understand her. When she brought him water, he reached for the cup, but his hand shook too hard to hold it. Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand over his and guiding the cup to his lips. He drank in small, careful sips, and she supported the weight of the cup until he finished. "Why help me?" he asked again, softer this time. Clara sank onto the stool beside the bed. The firelight flickered across his wounded side, illuminating the angry red swelling and the beads of sweat on his brow. She saw the strength in him, even now strength wrapped in exhaustion. "My father." She paused, swallowing the tightness in her throat. He used to say that saving someone, anyone, is never the wrong choice, even if the world tells you otherwise. A faint shift in Tahan's expression, respect, or something near it, softened the hard line of his mouth. "You are brave," he said. She let out a shaky laugh. "I'm terrified." "Still brave." Their eyes met just for a moment, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Clara felt it like a spark gliding across dry cedar bark, dangerous, impossible, yet warming in a way that scared her more than the sheriff's threats. She looked away first. "Let me check your wound," she said gently, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. As she unwrapped the makeshift bandage she had applied earlier, Tahan remained still, jaw clenched against the pain. His trust felt heavier than any weight she'd ever carried. Clara barely slept that night. She sat by the hearth long after the fire burned low, feeding it small pieces of wood to keep the room warm enough for the injured warrior stretched out on her bed. Tahan lay in a restless, fevered half-sleep, muttering in a language she didn't understand. Sometimes his fingers twitched, as if gripping invisible reins or reaching for a bow. Sometimes his breath hitched with pain. Every time he stirred, Clara rose from her chair to check his bandages, adjust his blankets, or cool his forehead with a damp cloth. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. The sheriff would return. Tahan's people would come. Two forces, both capable of violence, both led by men who followed their own laws, not the laws written on paper in the county office. She had no reason to trust either of them. The only certainty she had was lying in her bed, fevered, wounded, and entirely vulnerable. When dawn finally crept across the horizon, Clara stepped outside to fetch more wood. The winter morning bit at her cheeks, stinging with that sharp prairie cold that made the world feel both alive and unforgiving. Snow glittered like broken glass beneath the pale sunlight. She scanned the horizon out of instinct and froze. In the distance, far, but not far enough, shadows moved across the ridge. Dark silhouettes on horseback. They weren't racing like the sheriff's men had the night before. They moved silently, steady, with purpose. Clara couldn't see faces or details, but she knew. These weren't ranchers. These weren't lawmen. These were Comanche. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear hollowed out her chest. She hurried inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Tyan stirred at the noise, his eyes opening to slits. "What happened?" he rasped. Clara's voice trembled. "There are riders on the ridge." At first, he didn't speak. His gaze sharpened, cutting through the haze of fever. He pushed himself upright despite the pain etched into every movement. "How many?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "More than 5. Less than 20. He exhaled, slow and heavy. "My people." His certainty made the room shrink. Clara backed up a step without meaning to. "Will they hurt me?" she whispered. Tan's eyes softened not pity, but something steadier, deeper. "You saved me." "They will listen," but Clara wasn't convinced. She imagined a dozen warriors surrounding her home, arrows drawn, mistrust blazing in their eyes. She imagined Tyan having to fight for her, fight his own to keep her alive. She imagined the sheriff's posse riding in at the wrong moment, turning her land into a battlefield. Her hands shook. "They'll think I captured you, or hid you." Or, Tyan lifted a hand, stopping her spiraling fear. "You did not harm me." "They will know." "How?" she pressed. "How could they know anything about me?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Because they know me." The words were too layered to decipher, but Clara felt the truth in them. He wasn't a nameless warrior. He wasn't insignificant. Whoever he was among his people, they would not abandon him, and they would not take lightly to finding him sheltered in the home of a white woman. Just then, a faint tremor ran through the ground. Clara didn't need to look to understand. The riders were closer. Tyan swung his legs over the edge of the bed, but his strength was failing him. Clara rushed to his side, catching him before he fell. "You can't stand," she whispered urgently. "You're too weak." "I must," he said, voice strained but firm. "If I meet them lying down, they will think I am dead or shamed." Or taken. Clara hesitated, but she knew he was right. With her help, he braced himself against the table, beads in his braids catching the morning light as he drew breath through clenched teeth. Outside, hoofbeats grew clearer, closer, surrounding. Clara's heart pounded so hard it drowned out every other sound. Tyan turned to her then, his expression solemn. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "do not show fear. It gives power to the wrong hands." Clara swallowed, nodding, though fear roared through her like a flood. Then he added, low and unwavering, "And remember, I will speak for you." A shadow fell across the window, then another, then another. The Comanche had arrived. The ground trembled with the weight of the approaching horses. Clara felt the vibrations travel up through the cabin floorboards and into her bones, each one a reminder that there was no turning back now. She stood beside Tyan as he clung to the table, his breath tight, his muscles trembling from the strain of remaining upright. Outside, the horses slowed. Snorts, the creak of leather saddles, and muffled voices in Comanche drifted through the cabin walls. A heavy silence followed, an expectant, dangerous quiet that made Clara's skin prickle. Tyan straightened, pushing past pain that would have brought a weaker man to his knees. "Open door," he said, voice low but steady. "If they see you hide, they think you guilty." Clara swallowed hard. Her palms were slick with fear, but she nodded. Slowly she lifted the wooden bar from the latch and pulled the door open. A rush of cold air swept inside. And with it eyes, dozens of them. Warriors on horseback encircled her home, their silhouettes etched against the pale morning sky. Feathers braided into their hair fluttered in the wind, faces painted in colors that spoke of tradition, warning, and battle. Their expressions were unreadable as their gaze moved from Clara to Tyan. One rider dismounted and stepped forward. He was older, broad-shouldered, his black hair streaked with silver. His presence alone carried weight, the kind that needed no introduction. He spoke in Comanche, the words sharp, questioning, layered with emotion. Tayan responded, voice strained but resolute. Clara stood frozen as the exchange continued, long, tense, and completely incomprehensible to her. But she didn't need to know the words to understand their meaning. The older warrior's gaze kept darting to her, suspicious, narrow. Tayan's voice, though weak, carried defiance. He was defending her, arguing for her. The older warrior stepped closer, now standing just a few feet from where she stood. His eyes bore into her, dark and sharper than any blade. He spoke again, slower this time, direct, pointed. Clara's heart pounded. I don't understand, she whispered. Tan turned to her, breath hitching. He asks why you helped me. Why you risked death, Clara swallowed, throat tight. She met the older warrior's gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. Because he was hurt, she said softly. And because I couldn't let him die. The warrior didn't move, didn't blink. Tan translated, though his voice trembled with pain. A murmur rippled through the circle of riders. Some looked surprised, some skeptical, some angry. Then another warrior, tall, younger, more aggressive, rode forward, speaking sharply. His tone carried accusation. His hand hovered near the knife at his waist. Clara felt the air tighten. Tayan responded sharply, trying to stand straighter, gripping the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. But his legs buckled. Clara lunged to steady him, her hand gripping his arm. The riders reacted instantly, bows drawn, arrows aimed straight at her. Clara froze, breath trapped in her chest. Tayan raised his hand weakly, commanding them to stop. He spoke urgently, fiercely, though his strength was fading fast. Slowly, reluctantly, the warriors lowered their weapons. The older warrior stepped closer. He studied Clara for a long, heavy moment. Then he spoke in halting English. You shelter him. You feed him. You hide him from white hunters. His eyes narrowed. Why? Clara's fear surged, but so did something else. Resolve. Because he is a man, she said quietly. And because no one deserves to be hunted like an animal. Not even by my own people. The older warrior's expression shifted barely, but enough. A flicker of something that might have been respect or curiosity. Tayan sagged suddenly, limbs trembling, and Clara caught him again before he collapsed. She could feel the fever radiating from him. The older warrior noticed. His jaw tightened. He barked an order. Two riders dismounted instantly, approaching with urgency. Clara tensed, unsure if they meant harm, but the older warrior raised a hand. No hurt, he said firmly. He is family. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Family. Tayan wasn't just a warrior. He was someone important, someone whose injury had shaken his people, and Clara had saved him. The older warrior, as dusk settled over the plains, painting the horizon in a burnished sweep of rose gold, the quiet station town seemed to hold its breath. For 3 days Clara had been suspended between her past and her future, and now with a warm meal in her stomach, a roof over her head, and a child who clung to her like she had always belonged her. Heart was beginning to unthaw in ways she hadn't expected. But Part 7 begins the moment the rancher, Eli Harding, returns to the porch after tending the horses. The screen door creaked softly behind him. Dust clung to his boots, and the fading sunlight caught in his hair, making him look like the kind of man carved from the land itself, steady, weather-worn, trustworthy. Clara watched him silently as he paused at the railing, gaze drifting toward the swelling evening shadows. Even without speaking, she sensed the thoughtfulness in him. Ile wasn't a man who rushed anything. That was clear now. He took care with his words, with his work, with his daughter, but more than anything, he took care with his promises. And though he hadn't said much since bringing her to his home, every action had been a gesture of quiet sincerity. Inside the house, little Mazzie slept curled under a quilt, her tiny hand still gripping the hem of Clara's skirt even in dreams. Clara gently tucked the fabric free and stepped out to join Eli on the porch. Evening wind swept over them, cool but not unfriendly. "You've had a long few days," Eli said softly, not turning his head but clearly aware of her presence. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice warm but cautious. "Longer than I ever expected." Eli's jaw shifted, as though he were considering a matter he'd mulled over for too long already. "Maisie's taken to you," he finally said. "Hasn't taken to anyone the way she has to you since her mother passed." Clara's breath caught. She'd known the shadow existed something heavy behind the little girl's yearning eyes, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "She's a sweet child," Clara murmured. "She just wants to feel safe, and you've given her that," Eli answered. His voice was low, almost rough. Clara couldn't tell whether he was thanking her or confessing something deeper. The pause between them stretched, gentle but pulsing with possibility. Then Eli turned, bracing one arm against the porch post. His eyes clear, earnest, searching held hers. "She asked you that question earlier. About marrying me." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Children say things they don't understand fully." "Maybe," he said. "But she doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Silence fell again, but this time it felt like the moment before a match is struck. Eli took a slow breath. "I'm not asking anything of you," he continued. "You've been through enough. You deserve time to decide what you want, not what anyone else wants for you, including my daughter. Including me." There it was, the gentleness she wasn't used to. The freedom to choose. Clara had spent her life under expectations, under pressure, under promises made by others on her behalf. But here stood a man who asked nothing except honesty. Clara stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the porch rail beside his. "I don't know what the future looks like," she admitted softly, "but this house, this place, feels more like home than any place I've been in years." Eli's eyes softened, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Then that's enough for now," he said. "We'll take this one step at a time." And in the quiet of the settling night, Clara realized something she hadn't dared consider before. Maybe the child's question wasn't a promise. Maybe it was a beginning. Morning came softly to the Harding Ranch, with sunlight spilling like warm honey across the wooden floors. Clara woke to the faint sound of birdsong and the distant clatter of pans from the kitchen. For the first time in days, maybe longer, she felt rested. She sat up slowly, brushing a loose curl from her cheek, realizing she wasn't cold, hungry, or waiting for the next disappointment. The house felt lived in, warm, safe, and astonishingly welcoming. When she stepped into the hallway, the scent of frying biscuits and fresh coffee drifted toward her. Little Maisie stood on a stool beside the stove, stirring something with immense concentration, while Eli hovered close behind her to ensure she didn't burn herself. Maisie spotted Clara first. "You're awake." She squealed. "Papa said I could help cook 'cause you might be hungry." Clara's heart warmed instantly. "I am hungry," she said. "And it smells incredible." Eli turned from the counter, his expression steady but undeniably softer than it had been the night before. "Morning," he said simply. "Hope you don't mind simple cooking." Clara shook her head gently. After the last few days, simple sounds like heaven. Breakfast was humble biscuits, scrambled eggs, a jar of peach preserves, but Clara found herself savoring every bite. Not because the food was special, but because of the atmosphere, the steady crackle of the stove fire, Maisie's cheerful chatter, the quiet glances Eli kept sending her way when he thought she wouldn't notice. It felt like the fragile beginnings of something she didn't dare name yet. After the meal, Maisie tugged at Clara's hand. "Come see my pony, please?" Eli started to intervene, "Pumpkin, give Clara some time to settle," but Clara squeezed Maisie's hand lightly. "I'd love to see your pony." Outside, the morning air was fresh, crisp, and bright. Dew clung to the grass, and the mountains in the distance stood like silent guardians. Maisie practically skipped ahead, leading Clara to a small corral where a fuzzy Palomino pony grazed lazily. "Her name's Buttercup," Maisie announced proudly. "Papa says I'm big enough to brush her, but not ride alone yet." Clara knelt beside the pony, running her fingers through the soft, warm fur. "She's beautiful," she said, smiling genuinely. Maisie leaned closer, whispering conspiratorially, "Papa likes you. I can tell." Clara's cheeks warmed. "Maisie." "It's true," the little girl insisted. "He looks at you like he used to look at Mama, except he's sadder now. But maybe not so sad today." Clara didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being wanted, not by a child, not by a family, not even by fate. It was as if every choice up until this moment had steered her toward a place where she didn't have to keep surviving alone. A soft shuffle behind them made Clara turn. Eli stood quietly a few steps away, hat in hand, as though he'd been watching for a while before deciding to approach. "Maisie," he said gently, "why don't you run and get Buttercup's brush?" The girl darted off happily. Eli stepped closer. "She talks a lot," he said with a faint, sheepish smile. "I don't mind," Clara replied. His gaze lingered on her steady, careful, but undeniably warm. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for being patient with her. She's been lonely." "More than a child should ever have to be," Clara exhaled slowly. "Lonely is something I understand," she said quietly. Eli nodded, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he murmured. "No expectations, no pressure," Clara swallowed. There it was again, freedom, gently offered, not demanded. Maisie returned then, running full speed and shouting, "Clara! Buttercup wants you to brush her first." As Clara took the brush and Maisie hugged her waist, she felt it again, something inside her shifting, opening, daring. Maybe this wasn't just temporary shelter. Maybe it was the first hint of belonging. The afternoon sun dipped low, painting the Harding Ranch in hues of deep amber and bronze. Shadows stretched long across the pasture as Clara stood by the fence, Buttercup nuzzling her shoulder while Maisie braided wildflowers into the pony's mane. It was peaceful, astonishingly peaceful, considering how chaotic her life had been just days before. Clara could almost pretend this was her world. A warm ranch, a sweet child, a steady man. Almost. But the silence didn't last. Eli appeared on the porch, his silhouette tall and still against the falling light. "Clara," he called, his voice calm but edged with something heavier. "Can you come inside for a moment?" The tone made her stomach tighten. She gently handed the brush back to Maisie. "I'll be right back, sweetheart." "Okay." "I'll finish decorating Buttercup," the girl chirped, completely unaware of the tension threading the air. Clara walked toward the porch, her pulse quickening. Inside, Eli had set a pot of coffee on the table, untouched. His hat lay beside it neatly, as though he had taken the time to prepare for a serious conversation. He turned to her, his jaw working before he spoke. "Clara," he said gently, "there's something I need to ask you. And something I need to tell you." She braced herself. "All right." He stepped closer, folding his arms loosely as though trying to keep himself steady. "I spoke with Sheriff Dowgan this morning." Her breath caught. Instantly she felt cornered. "About me?" "No," Eli replied quickly, shaking his head. "Not at first. He was asking about the Comanche, the one you helped. Said the posse is restless again. There's talk of riding out in larger numbers." Clara's pulse thudded painfully. Her mind raced to the cellar, to Tahan's face, to the desperate fear in his eyes. Eli noticed her reaction. "Clara," he said softly, "I need to know the whole truth. I'm not asking to judge you. I'm asking so I can protect you. And Maisie," she swallowed hard. The fear she'd been hiding rose to her throat like a tide. "If I tell you everything—" Will you believe me? Try me, he said, voice steady, gaze unwavering. Clara took a slow breath. Then she told him. She described finding Tyann bleeding in the snow, hiding him under the floorboards, while the posse thundered across her land, the fever she fought to break, and the truth Tyann had whispered about defending a child during a botched raid. She told Eli how she had trusted her instincts, not the fear-mongering that came from town. And then she told him about waking to find a ring of Comanche warriors surrounding her house and being spared. When she finished, Eli didn't speak. Not at first. He stepped away, bracing his hands on the counter, running a slow breath through his nose. Clara's chest ached. She thought he might turn her out, tell her she brought danger to his door. She wouldn't blame him. Finally he turned back to her, eyes sober but not angry. You risked your life, he said quietly. Not just for him, but for what was right. Clara blinked in surprise. Eli continued, most folks wouldn't have done what you did. Hell, most folks would have turned him in and called themselves heroes. But you, he paused, searching for the right word. You saw a man instead of an enemy, she trembled. Does that mean you trust me? Eli stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth radiating from him. Clara, he said, voice low and sincere, I trusted you the moment I saw how Maisie looked at you. Her breath stilled. And now? She whispered. He reached out slowly, as though giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand. Now, he said, I'm asking how I can help you. Whatever comes next. You don't face it alone. The words shook her. Eli's hand was firm, warm, steady in a way her world had never been. Before she could answer, a sharp voice rang from outside. Papa, Clara. Look, Maisie stood at the fence, pointing toward the distant ridge. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, silhouettes dark against the fading sun. Clara's heart dropped. The posse was coming back. And this time, they weren't riding to talk. The last streaks of sunlight painted the prairie in molten gold and crimson as Clara and Eli raced toward the porch, Maisie clinging tightly to Clara's hand. The distant thrum of hooves had grown louder, heavier, echoing across the open fields like a drumbeat of danger. Clara's chest pounded not just from fear, but from the strange, wild exhilaration of standing on the edge of something bigger than herself. Eli positioned himself between Clara and Maisie, hand resting on the rifle propped against the railing. Stay close, he instructed, voice calm but taut with urgency. They're closing fast. Clara's gaze swept to the horizon. The riders 3, maybe 4, were moving with purpose, and it didn't take long for her to recognize one of them, Sheriff Dowgan. His hat pulled low, coat flapping, eyes like a hawk hunting prey. They had returned for blood, for justice as they saw it, for the Comanche warriors she had hidden. But before her panic could fully take hold, a sound she didn't expect reached her ears. The steady clop of additional hooves behind the sheriff's men. Tyann's band had come. Their arrival wasn't loud or chaotic, but precise, disciplined, a perfect counter to the sheriff's posse. Clara felt her breath catch here were 2 worlds, colliding at her doorstep, and somehow, by the sheer will of fate and courage, they were in balance. The sheriff's posse slowed as the Comanche warriors drew near, surrounding the trespassers. Weapons glinted, arrows ready, and for a moment it seemed the tension might snap like a taut rope. But Clara noticed Tyann at the forefront, walking carefully, deliberately, signaling restraint. She realized then that her fear wasn't the only thing hanging in the air. There was respect, honor, and a strange understanding crossing centuries of conflict, carried in the eyes of those who chose to see the truth. Tyann caught her gaze for a heartbeat. His lips curved into the faintest smile, enough to melt some of the terror that had rooted her to the porch. It was a promise. Trust him, and all will be well. Sheriff Dowgan sputtered, anger twisting his features. This isn't over. You can't. But the Comanche chief raised a hand. His gesture was simple, commanding, and yet impossibly gentle. The posse faltered. Weapons lowered not because they were afraid of blood, but because the moment demanded acknowledgement of courage, of loyalty, and of humanity. Clara's hand found Eli's. He squeezed gently, and in that small touch she found grounding. His presence was steady, protective, unwavering, the first constant she had known in years. The standoff ended with the sheriff grumbling and retreating, muttering about law and order, while the Comanche band acknowledged Tejan's survival and Clara's bravery. Tejan came forward, weak but upright, and his dark eyes met hers. "You were brave," he said simply, voice low. "More than anyone I've known." Clara felt a warmth surge through her. She wasn't just the homesteader who hid a wounded warrior. She was someone who had changed the course of lives, not just Tejan's, but her own. Eli stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've done more than survive," he said softly. "You've helped create something none of us expected. A life worth protecting." The wind carried away the last echoes of hooves and shouting, leaving the prairie calm. Clara looked at Tejan, then at Eli, then at Maisie laughing at the fence, and understood. Love had found them, not through safety or ease, but through courage, risk, and the heart's refusal to surrender. Tejan bowed slightly in respect to Eli, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Trust had been earned. Clara's hand met Tejan's briefly, then returned to Eli's. She realized she didn't have to choose one over the other. Love could